December the 28th, 2015. A dressing room, backstage, somewhere on the road with Scorpions. A single bulb over the mirror. A phone buzzing on the counter, face down, insistent. Rudolf Schenker picks it up, reads 3 words, and the room tilts. Lemmy is dead. Somewhere in Los Angeles, in a house full of memorabilia and dog-eared books, the loudest voice in rock and roll has gone quiet, 4 days after his 70th birthday. And in an hour, Rudolf Schenker is supposed to walk onto a stage in front of thousands of screaming fans and play like nothing in the world has just broken. This is the story of what happens when grief meets the spotlight. Of a band that had to decide, night after night, how far sorrow is allowed to go before it swallows the show whole. Of an old friendship forged in smoky clubs decades earlier, and how Scorpions chose to carry it forward when the man who lived it beside them could not. To understand what Rudolf lost that December night, you have to go back almost 40 years, to a Germany still catching its breath after the war, to clubs with sticky floors and amplifiers held together with gaffer tape. Scorpions were young then, hungry, touring package bills across Europe where the lineup changed every night, but the bruises never healed. Somewhere on those same circuits, a scrappy, mutton-chopped bassist named Lemmy Kilmister was building something loud and merciless with a band called Motorhead. The 2 acts crossed paths the way traveling musicians always do. Shared dressing rooms, shared cigarettes, shared complaints about promoters who never paid on time. Rudolf remembered him instantly. Not because Lemmy was famous yet, he wasn't, but because he was unmistakable. The wart on his cheek, the cowboy boots, the voice like gravel dragged over a highway, and underneath all of it, a warmth he saved for people he trusted. Scorpions and Motorhead were never the same kind of band. One reached for melody, for the soaring hooks that would carry them to stadiums. The other reached for the throat. But Rudolf understood something early that took the rest of the world years to catch up on. That loud music, played honestly, was its own brotherhood, no matter which side of the volume knob you lived on. He and Lemmy shook hands somewhere in a corridor in the 70s, and the handshake never really ended. Over the decades that followed, the friendship deepened the way road friendships do, in small, unglamorous moments nobody photographs. Late nights after gigs, sitting on flight cases with a bottle passed back and forth, trading stories about promoters who'd cheated them and girlfriends who'd left them. Card games in the back of tour buses that ran until sunrise. Lemmy, famous for never sleeping, for playing the fruit machines in hotel lobbies at 4 in the morning while everyone else collapsed. Rudolf, the quieter one, the businessman of Scorpions, the man who kept the band alive through 5 different decades of music fashion, found in Lemmy something rare. A friend who wanted nothing from him except honesty and a good laugh. They would run into each other at festivals across Europe, in Wacken and Donington, and a dozen fields turned to mud by rain and beer. And every single time it was the same ritual. A bear hug, a shot of something strong, and an hour of talk that picked up exactly where it had left off months before. Klaus Meine, too, considered Lemmy family. The kind of friend you didn't need to call every week, because you both knew the bond wasn't going anywhere. For men who had spent their lives on stages built to look larger than life, Lemmy was proof that you could be a legend and still just be a guy leaning on a bar, telling the truth. By 2015, the road had started asking a higher price of Lemmy than it once had. He'd survived diabetes for years, carried a heart device to keep his rhythm steady, and friends who saw him up close noticed the toll. The frame thinner, the pace slower between sets, though the voice on stage remained just as ferocious as ever. Still, nobody around him imagined the end was close. Motorhead played their final show in Germany that December, Lemmy snarling through the set as if the years hadn't touched him at all. On the 24th, he turned 70, and friends around the world raised glasses to him, certain there would be many more birthdays to come. 2 days later, doctors found something aggressive, something that had been hiding, something that gave him no time at all. On December the 28th, surrounded by the small circle of people closest to him, Lemmy Kilmister died at home. The announcement went out the next day, and it moved through the rock world like a shockwave through steel. Sudden, total, impossible to absorb all at once.
For Rudolf, the news didn't arrive as a headline. It arrived as a phone call, a text message, a bandmate's face suddenly pale in a hallway. He has described that day since as one of the hardest of his life on the road. Not because it was unexpected in the abstract sense that all death is unexpected, but because Lemmy had always seemed built from something sturdier than the rest of them, indestructible in the way that only the loudest people in the room ever seemed to be. Rudolf sat with the news the way you sit with news that refuses to become real. He thought about the corridor handshake in the 70s. He thought about card games and shared bottles and festivals in the rain. And then he thought about the clock, ticking toward a show that thousands of people had bought tickets to see. A show that was, in a matter of hours, still going to happen whether his heart was ready or not. The band gathered that afternoon in a room nobody wanted to be in. Klaus Meine spoke first, his voice low, asking the question that mattered more than any of them wanted to admit. Could they even play tonight? Matthias Jobs sat with his guitar untouched in its case, unable to look at it. There was a real aching pull toward cancellation, toward simply telling the promoter that grief had won for one night. But Rudolf, even through his own devastation, kept coming back to something he knew about Lemmy in his bones. Lemmy Kilmister had missed exactly one Motorhead show in over 4 decades on the road, and that was for a health emergency that nearly killed him. He believed, with something close to religious conviction, that the show was a promise to the people in the seats, and that a true rock and roller kept that promise even when it cost him everything. Rudolf looked around at his bandmates and said what he believed Lemmy himself would have said. Canceling tonight doesn't bring him back. Playing does something else. It keeps him alive in the only place he ever really lived, inside the noise. So they went on. That night, before a single note of the set, Rudolf Schenker walked to the front of the stage alone, the arena lights dimmed to a single spot, and told the audience what had happened. He didn't perform the announcement. His voice cracked in the middle of it, and for a moment, the biggest room in the building went utterly silent. Thousands of strangers suddenly united in the same held breath. He asked for a moment of quiet for a friend of 40 years, a brother in loud music, gone too soon. And then, before Scorpions played a single song of their own, they gave the crowd a few bars of pure Motorhead thunder, the opening riff of the song that had defined Lemmy's entire life, played not as a cover, but as a salute, raw and a little ragged with emotion. Guitars distorted just enough to sound like grief turned into noise. The crowd roared, not with excitement, but with recognition.
thousands of lighters and phone lights rising into the dark like a single trembling flame. Rudolf has said that moment felt less like a performance and more like a funeral held at full volume, the only kind Lemmy would ever have wanted. That single night became a template the band didn't fully choose, but couldn't abandon either. Show after show, city after city, the question returned: how do you honor him tonight without letting the sorrow take over the room? Some nights the tribute was quiet, a spoken dedication, a photograph on the screens behind the drum riser, Lemmy's familiar silhouette against a black backdrop. Other nights the band leaned harder into the raw, unpolished aggression that Lemmy himself had always loved, letting the set run a little rowdier, a little more unfiltered, as if daring the grief to keep up. Backstage, away from the lights, the mood was heavier than fans in the crowd could ever know. Rudolf found himself returning to memories mid-conversation, mid-meal, mid-sound check. The kind of sudden ambush that grief specializes in. He later admitted there were nights he had to compose himself in the wings, take one long breath, and remind himself that the fans on the other side of the curtain hadn't come to watch him mourn. They had come to be lifted. Balancing those two truths, night after night, became its own quiet act of discipline, arguably harder than any guitar solo he had ever played. The fans made it easier, even as they made it harder to hold back tears. Night after night, Rudolf noticed the same small gestures scattered through the front rows. Hand-lettered signs bearing Lemmy's name, Ace of Spades patches sewn onto old denim jackets, a stray black cowboy hat held up toward the lights during the quiet moment of remembrance. Letters found their way backstage, too, passed hand to hand by security and crew. Strangers writing to say that Motorhead and Scorpions had shaped their entire adolescence, that hearing both bands honored together in the same set felt like watching two halves of their own youth collide. Rudolf read some of them alone in his dressing room after sound check, the arena still empty, the seats still folded up along the walls, and found himself grateful in a way that surprised him. Grateful that grief this public didn't have to be carried alone, that thousands of strangers a night were somehow carrying a piece of it with him. It didn't erase the loss. Nothing could. But it reframed the ritual, night after night, from something he dreaded into something closer to communion. An entire room agreeing, together, that a friend like that deserved to be remembered loudly. What made the loss cut even deeper was the timing. Motorhead, the band Lemmy had built and refused to let die even as his own body worked against him, effectively ended with him. There would be no replacement voice, no continuation tour, no version of that band without its singular engine at the front. For musicians who loved him, the grief carried an extra weight. Not just a friend gone, but an entire musical world that had closed its doors in the same instant. Rudolf spoke about it in interviews with a rawness he rarely allowed himself in public, calling Lemmy irreplaceable, a one-of-a-kind force that rock and roll would not see again. And yet inside the tragedy, something unexpected began to take shape, a thread connecting Motorhead's ending to Scorpions' next chapter, one that nobody in that stunned dressing room could have predicted in the days right after the funeral. In the months that followed, as 2016 arrived and Scorpions faced a lineup change of their own, a name surfaced that carried Lemmy's fingerprints all over it. Mickey D., the powerhouse drummer who had sat behind Motorhead's kit for over 2 decades,
who had stood a few feet from Lemmy on stages across the world for the better part of his career, joined Scorpions as their new drummer. For Rudolf, it felt like more than a hiring decision. It felt like the universe closing a circle that grief had torn open. Here was a man who had lived inside Lemmy's band, who understood the same relentless work ethic, the same refusal to let the road win, now sitting behind Scorpion's own rhythm section, carrying a piece of that old Brotherhood forward into a new one.
Watching Mickey settle behind the kit at soundcheck for the first time, Rudolf has said, felt like watching an old friend's spirit find a new address. A small, strange mercy tucked inside an otherwise brutal year. Looking back on that December now, Rudolf Schenker describes it less as a single tragedy and more as a lesson etched permanently into how Scorpions approach every stage they've stepped onto since. Rock and roll, he has said, was never really about the songs alone. It was about the people who lived inside them, who turned smoky clubs and stadium floors into something like family, who showed up for each other decade after decade, whether the cameras were rolling or not. Losing Lemmy taught the band that the show going on isn't cold professionalism. It's love, dressed up in distortion and volume, refusing to let a friend's memory fade into silence. Somewhere out on the road tonight, in arenas Rudolf can no longer count, that lesson still plays out in small ways. A dedication before a song, a look shared between bandmates who remember, a drummer who once stood beside Lemmy Kilmister, keeping perfect time behind Scorpion's music. Grief didn't derail the show. It became part of what the show meant. And 40 years after a handshake in a corridor between two hungry young bands, that friendship is still, in its own way, being played out loud every single night.